good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in this place. Hello and welcome to our monthly webinar. My name is Megan Hall and I'm part of the Learning Without Barriers team here at Life Without Barriers. My colleague Michelle Murray is also in the room today. Michelle's going to lead us through our content today, and our webinar today is around the impacts of trauma on learning. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment for us all to firmly place our feet on the ground and remind ourselves that we are on stolen lands that have never been ceded. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Yagara and the Turrbal people in Meanjin in Brisbane. I recognise that this place has always been a place of learning and of education and of being with, standing with, walking with, and I acknowledge the deep relationship that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have with this place, and the processes that have guided them over millennia. Always was, always will be. So thank you for that. People are just going to be coming in and out of this room, and that's okay, but I am going to hand over to Michelle in the interests of time. We do this as a bit of a drop-in, so we don't want to take up heaps of your time, but we know that these places are really important places to have good conversation about what's going on for our young people in education. So it's all yours, Michelle. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Megan, and good afternoon, everybody. Good morning for those who are coming to us from West Australia. My name is Michelle Murray. I'm the Director for Education and Development in LWB Education. It's really lovely to be with you here today on this, as Megan said, our first webinar for 2026. We're talking today about the impacts of trauma on learning. I've got a little bit of a slide presentation that I'll share with you. That should go for about 20 minutes or so. And then I'm really hopeful that we can have some questions and some conversations happening after that. I'm very aware that we have this beautiful, rich knowledge in the room here with us. We have carers and pracs and therapeutic specialists and all sorts of amazing people out there who have got lots of experience and lots of great knowledges. I'm sure that we can all share. So I might just jump then into, I'm going to share my screen and we'll start with a bit of PowerPoint. If a question comes to you while I'm talking in the PowerPoint, maybe drop it into chat so you don't forget it. Megan will keep an eye on that. And then, as I said, once we've gone through that slide presentation, then we'll have a chance to hopefully have a good chat about all things learning. So let me share my screen.
You're all good, Michelle.
Okay, that's working, Megan. Yep, perfect. Excellent. All right. Thanks, Megan, for that really lovely acknowledgement that you started with. I'd also like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of all the lands we're meeting from today. And I also would just really like to acknowledge our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who are in education, and that the importance of cultural connection, knowledges and connections that happen every day at school. You know, we know that makes a real difference for our young people in school, so we always want to put that front and centre of everything that we do. And just to acknowledge that it always was, always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. So some things that we're going to start with just on the topic of the impact of trauma on learning. This will just help kind of ground us, you know, a little bit in the conversation, I hope. The first thing is that when I'm talking about school here, I'm really talking about a pretty broad range of school, you know, every learning setting from preschool all the way through up to high school. That means that this talk is pretty generalised across developmental stages and ages, but I hope that it's still, you know, relevant to you, from whichever aspect you're really thinking about children from. I think the other thing that's probably really important to acknowledge as well is that schools have this, there's a whole range of capacity and responses in schools. You know, we know that we've all worked with schools with really high levels of excellent support, for our young people who may be presenting, you know, with complex needs in the school setting. And we also are aware of schools who struggle more to provide that level of support. And then that really impacts then on our roles, So in some schools, we might need to have a stronger advocacy role for more support within systems, In other schools, we can be that really genuine partner, in working in how to support the young person. So I just want to acknowledge that, when I talk again generally about schools, every school is different. Every classroom, has different strengths. Principals are different in how they lead schools. Again, some lead schools in very trauma-informed ways, and others are still on that learning journey, shall we say. So just to kind of acknowledge that. Again, while I'm going to talk about the themes on how trauma and adversity can impact learning, every child's going to look different, and every child is going to have different strengths. And, that might be the environment that they're in. As I said, if they're in a very, supportive school with a, teacher who has, great strategies that she's applying across the classroom, then the supports that are needed for that child is going to look different, As I said in the acknowledgement, cultural connection and learning is key for our First Nations children, so I always want to put that front and centre of any of the work that we do. The fourth point there, it's kind of this conundrum, about school, in that school can be both a really complex place for our young people who've experienced trauma and adversity, can also be a really strong place of connection and healing, and sometimes it can be both of those at the same time, but what we do know is that when school is working well for a young person, when they do feel connected at school, that we know that other things in a young person's life tends to be going better as well. So the time that we invest in education and in school can have these really strong flow-on positive effects. We know, for example, when school is stable, it helps placement stability. So we feel very strongly about, trying to provide that support to make school a place that is a place of connection and healing. But we do know that the environment of school and learning has a lot of moving parts, and for a young person that's experienced trauma, a lot of those moving parts can challenge their feelings of safety, and that can vary from moment to moment and from day to day. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And just that final point that I've got there, that the social, emotional and cognitive or learning disorders or difficulties, they are recognised in systems for additional support. So while sometimes if we're looking at some of what the education systems have in place for additional support, and they might not specify trauma, certainly the impacts of trauma are recognised, if that makes sense. So that, if you have high levels of anxiety, if you display characteristics like ADHD, poor concentration, if you've got significant learning difficulties, all of those things can be recognised in the systems where we can advocate for additional support. I'm not going to talk a lot about those things today, but if you want more information on that, you please feel free to reach out, because there are certain things in place in our systems that we can lean on to advocate for that support. And it doesn't always need a formal diagnosis. So while a formal diagnosis is helpful, we can see through the adjustments that a teacher needs to make that ensures a child is supported well at school, that we can impute, that's the language that's used, we can impute that they have high levels of social, emotional and or cognitive learning needs, and that level of adjustment then justifies why we can apply for that additional support. So what are the possible impacts on schooling success? And again, there's a whole lot of things on this page that can feel, a little bit overwhelming. Remember, how it looks for each individual young person will be different. For some young people, there will be more or less of these impacts. For some young people, there will be some of these and not all of these. For some young people, there will be every single one of these things, that's listed here. Yeah. So some of the impacts on learning that I really wanted to draw out, one was being really aware of language delays. And again, while language delays are more evident, or it's easier to see in our younger kiddies before they start school, we know if young people, little children are late to talking, or they're not using many words, it's pretty obvious. Language delays can become more hidden as children get older, and they can start to be expressed more in the written form. Yeah, so if you've had language delays in your spoken language, then that will translate into some delays in the written language. Yeah, so if you're working, or if you're supporting, or you have little ones that are in that 0 to 5 age range, and you're worried about their language, really get onto it. That would be my hot tip, because everything that we can do in those early stages to really strengthen language development, and by language I mean capacity for listening and understanding what's being said, and I also mean how children express themselves, their vocabulary. It's a really important thing to be keeping an eye on. Difficulties or impacts on cognition, and cognition is a really big term that encompasses a lot of things, but it's things like reasoning, problem solving, concentration, memory, planning, organising, the ability to self-regulate. When I think about, to jump to some high school students, and this was, when I was, is that still right, Megan? It just shifted on my screen a bit. It's still good. Great, thanks.
Good, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. When I think about some of the young people that I worked with in high schools that had learning difficulties and potentially came from trauma backgrounds, but not always, we spent a lot of time on their organisational skills, and very explicitly supported young people in how do they follow their timetable, where are they up to, and probably for every parent who's got a young person in high school, this all might sound very familiar, but where are they up to, and where do they need to be up to in each subject if they've got an assignment coming up, and even down to what do you need to put in your school bag the night before, and all those sorts of things. A lot of time spent on organisational skills. It can be a real barrier, to learning for young people. In primary schools, it's primary school teachers are pretty helpful at helping kids organise themselves. By the time they get to high school, it's kind of really assumed that young people can do that for themselves, and a lot of the young people that I worked with certainly needed a lot of visual and a lot of actual support, check-ins around their organisational skills. Working memory difficulties. Working memory, again, I won't go into it too much, but it's this really interesting thing. Your working memory is where you're temporarily holding information and manipulating it. It's not there for long. It's really key in learning. So it's where you're processing new information and trying to make links to your long-term memory. Might be an example might be where you're holding a set of instructions while you're actually doing the task. So you might be on step 2 of doing the task, but you're holding steps 3 and 4 in your working memory. And when you get distracted, you lose your working memory really easily. Yeah. So that experience that you have when you walk into the room, that that you've walked into there for an intention, but you've lost that intention somewhere, that's because you've lost it out of your working memory. Yeah. We know that sleep difficulties, we know that lots of young people who've experienced childhood trauma have sleep difficulties, and that as we all know from our own experience, that really impacts concentration and ability to maintain concentration in learning. And the other one I've popped in there is resilience, and I'm kind of thinking about resilience perhaps in a slightly different way, but when I'm thinking about resilience in learning, what I'm really thinking about there is that capacity to I guess, feel a little bit stressed in learning. There's that thing that we call good stress and bad stress, yeah. And so that little bit of stress when you're learning something new, we all experience it to some degree. I'll talk a little bit more about it. But when we're learning new content, that can feel a little bit. There can be a little bit of stress in that. Again, for a young person who's experienced trauma, that little bit of stress can actually feel like an overwhelming thing. It can feel fearful, and so that can impact a young person's resilience to kind of hang in there through those feelings of stress, which again is an adaptation of a behaviour that's kept them safe, in the past. The other thing I think we always have to consider when we're talking about schooling success is impacts on social relationships, yeah, and that's relationships with teachers, teacher aides, the adults in the school, and also the social relationships with peers, yeah. Attachment difficulties can make attachment to school, more difficult. Difficulties with peer relationships can be quite common, yeah. And again, if you think about all of those difficulties that we've listed on, the left side, the difficulties with problem solving, planning, memory, things like that, you can see how that can potentially impact on peer relationships. Peer relationships are pretty complex, particularly, I was going to say particularly in high school, but maybe even, in primary school as well. And really understanding all of those social rules, yeah, that are happening in peer relationships, or understanding why something went wrong, or being able to repair when something goes wrong with peers. Yeah, it's complicated. It requires good cognition. It requires great language skills. It requires some level of attachment, etc. So we can really understand why peer relationships can be difficult for some young people. And just also popped in there a need for control, which again helps some young people with a trauma background to feel safe in their environment. But in a schooling environment, that can cause some complexities sometimes with teachers and other children. And I don't know if people have heard of PDA, which is now I can't even remember it, pervasive avoidance disorder. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but again, young people with high anxiety who really can't cope with demands being placed on them. So for those young people, everything in the classroom really has to be presented as choice. Yeah. So while these things feel like they could be overwhelming in a classroom, there are strategies, there are ways that we can work through some of these issues. I'm just going to now throw a few different models up. If anyone has sat on any of my talks before, you'll probably have seen some of these models. They're some of my favourite things. I like them because they're pretty simple. I like them because we can often use them with parents. We can use them with children, young people often, and they're also just good reminders for ourselves and for classrooms as well. I think if we can understand why things are happening a little bit, even from a simplistic kind of way, then it helps us find, some of the right strategies, and it helps build our understanding, really, and our empathy of why things are happening. So if we think about the brain, I've used this model without all the writing all over it, but I've used it a lot with young people to really help them, obviously after we've understood the brain model, but to really help them think about where are they in their brain. Yeah, if we're going to go into a complex conversation, maybe we're in a re-entry meeting, after some time out from school, I want to make sure that, if we're going to be talking about, if we're going to do some problem solving with the school, I want to make sure that the young person is able to access the cortex, the thinking part of their brain. Yeah, so I want them to be able to identify where they are, in the brain. If they're down in that red part, they're in the lower part of the brain. Yeah, that's the part of the brain that becomes really active in the, flight, fight, freeze responses. It's where your heart rate goes up or your blood pressure goes up, those sorts of things. So can a young person identify, can they feel those changes in their body? That are really a strong indicator, that they're operating from that part of the brain, which is the lower part of the brain, which means that they're not accessing that the higher level parts of the brain, the thinking parts of the brain. The limbic system, or the emotional kind of part of the brain, that green part, that's where, we really want to make sure that young people are getting some connection, so that we're connecting into that emotional part of the brain, and that part of the brain's regulated, and then we can get to the thinking part of the brain. I just want to point out the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brains, and you've probably heard a lot about it. You've probably heard that it's the part of the brain that develops the last, and in fact it's still developing, into our 20s. It doesn't mean it's not working at other parts of our development, but it just gets stronger, as the years go on. And it integrates all the areas, and it's this really important part of the brain that we call executive functioning. Yeah, so it's where we do that really high level problem solving. It's where we have our impulse control. It's where we can really think through the consequences, of our actions and make informed decisions. And again, I could talk about executive functioning for the rest of this talk, but it's an area that our young people often have difficulty with, because it's a skill. Yeah, one of the best ways to develop that skill with young people is to involve them in the problem solving, to find solutions for the issues, that are happening. The school message that I think is really important, firstly, the message for young people, I think that's really important, is that when they feel really stressed, or when they feel, unsafe, then the lower parts of the brain take over. Yeah, so I don't know if people know about the Dan Siegel hand model. Have a look at it on YouTube. The link's there. He calls it flipping the lid. When the lower parts of the brain, you flip your lid, it means that the upper thinking part of the brain isn't as engaged. Yeah, so you're not making decisions formed on, great thinking. You're really making them all from the emotional and the physical, parts of the body. We know that learning doesn't happen very well when the nervous system's in that survival mode. But we do know that through repeated experiences in safe and nurturing relationships, that's where we can help rewire the brain. That's called neuroplasticity. Yeah. And I really love the way that Bruce Perry talks about this. He talks about that we build on small, manageable doses of stress, which is a little bit what I alluded to before. We can help a young person who's had a trauma background get some success in learning, even when there is a little bit of stress, that good stress, we can build on that. That's what we're aiming to do in school for our young people. This is another model. This is a Bruce Perry model. Again, I like it because it shows really, in a fairly concrete way where our young people might be at. And we know that at school, because of all that stimuli, because of all the factors that are a little bit unknown, we know that our young people with a trauma background are often at school in their base level is often in the alert stage, which means that it doesn't take much for them to jump up to those higher states of escalation. So when we talk about children who jump from 0 to 100 in a split second, that's why. It's because they're already scanning the environment for threat, and they have a very sensitive stress response. and the brain is treating anything new as potentially threatening. And that can even be learning new content. Yeah. Sets up that feeling of this feels uncomfortable. When this feels uncomfortable, the lower part of my brain is taking over. Yeah. Again, this is another really helpful little explanation from the Australian Childhood Foundation. They talk about what they talk about as the sensitive stress response system and what can it look like at school. So again, if we look at those fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses, if we look at the fight one where we talk about at school, what might you see when the lower parts of the brain take over? Yeah, might be verbal threats, might be clenching your fist, might be an outburst, might be swearing, might be lashing out. So that, when a school says, there was a lot of swearing today, from Joe, we can't kind of tolerate, those sorts of behaviours, etc. I was kind of like to try and flip the conversation to, okay, so Joe's stress response was activated into a fight, flight, freeze mode. I wonder why. I wonder what was happening, in that environment that really activated that stress response system. So we're trying to shift it from it looking like kind of a deliberate behaviour to that's just the stress response system. Yeah. So what is it? What can we change? First, the first thing I want to look at is what can we change in the environment so that we can hopefully prevent that escalation, that activation of the sensitive stress response. Then how can we support potentially a different response for Joe when his stress system is activated? I think we often look at the second one, but perhaps we're not paying enough attention to the environment and what can we do proactively to prevent it happening in the first place. In the flight at school, we might see restlessness, climbing, hiding, running away. Had lots of young people that have been climbers. Lots of young people are restless. Yeah, and yet one of the expectations of school is how do we sit at a desk. Yeah. So again, what are the things that we're putting in place that can support a young person who, when their stress response system is activated, they become really restless? So what are the fidget toys? What's the sensory chair that they can sit in that helps them have a bit of connection to ground that can help them? Yeah. We know that the young people who really kind of demonstrate their behaviours in the fight and flight kind of modes, we know those young people. Yeah, schools know those young people. They're a little bit more evident. Young people who might display a little bit more of the freeze and fawn sorts of behaviour. So the young people who are a bit more withdrawn, a bit more spacey, or the young people who in the fawn who really display those people-pleasing behaviours. Again, the withdrawal in social situations, the unseen children, just as concerning because, again, they won't be accessing their learning, to their full capacity. But again, sometimes we overlook those children a little bit because they're a little bit easier to deal with in a classroom situation, right? They're not acting out, they're not disrupting other people's learning. But and also, young people can be all of those things and show all of those different behaviours at different times as well. So just my clicker there. Another Bruce Perry model that again I really like. It's just a reinforcement of that brain model that I saw before, but it's the regulate, relate, reason. It's our 3 R's really, which is really we need to regulate the body and the lower parts of the brain. We need to make sure there's an emotional connection so that the young person feels safe in the relationships that are happening. When that happens, then they can get to the thinking part of the brain, which is where learning happens. So for us, we need to think about, like, how are we supporting regulation at home? What's the routines? What's the breakfast? What's the activity that's really helping do that regulation? And then what supports connection when the child first gets to school? How do we help them feel safe in the relationships that are going to happen at school? If we can start getting some of those things happening well, then we're setting ourselves up for a better experience at school. And just quickly, this last one, because come from an education background, can't escape a zone of proximal development model. When we're learning, this is really the theory of how we learn. When we're learning, we have these, what we call these three zones. There's our comfort zone, which are the things that we can do. We know them, we can do them really comfortably. We have our challenge zone of the things that we can do with some assistance. It can be a lot of assistance, or it can be a small bit of assistance. When we're learning, we're jumping in and out of challenge and comfort zone. We do it all the time, same as adults as it is with children. When the learning step becomes too big, then we jump into a confusion and anxiety zone, and we can't do it. Yeah, but, we give up or we get overwhelmed. For a young person who's trauma impacted, we're just really stressed. What we tend to notice is that the comfort zone, the challenge zone decreases a little bit, but that confusion anxiety zone is bigger, so children can jump into that zone more quickly. Yeah. What's really important in schools is that we know where their learning levels are at, so that we can make sure that we are supporting them in their comfort zone and their challenge zones in learning that they can really genuinely access. Yeah. Sometimes I think, particularly when we've got young people with, a lot of behavioural issues happening at school, we tend to forget what's happening for them in the learning space, and that learning can be contributing to the behaviours. If a young person is feeling very overwhelmed in the learning, they might be working really hard to mask that so you don't see it because they don't want to be shamed. Yeah. But some of those behaviours are really about doing that. Not wanting to show that they can't do it, not wanting to show that they're in that confusion, anxiety zone. So again, really helpful for schools just to kind of remind them around, well, where's the young person's learning at, and how are we scaffolding that so that they're feeling comfortable, in their learning. Okay, enough models for you, but again, hopefully some of those have been helpful. Just a couple more slides and then I'm going to stop talking. I guess if we just think about the demands of a school for a young person, that can stack up. So, if we've got a young person who's sitting at a desk and they're in that restless kind of mode, that can take a fair bit of work for them just to sit at a desk, particularly if they haven't got any, some of those fidget toys or some of those other things that can kind of help them be there. You add to that a bit of new content, that's feeling a bit stressful. Then maybe the teacher wants you to show your work and you hate showing your work because you never, you never feel confident that your work's good enough. Then the bell goes and you have to navigate a transition. And suddenly there's a change to the routine. There's a visitor in the classroom. What are they doing there? What's the purpose of them being there? Is that going to impact on me? And then suddenly it starts raining. So now we've got a rainy day program for lunchtime. So now we're inside. So now there's a lot of noises that I'm not used to and a lot of smells of, all the kids' food, and that can be really triggering. Social interactions, relational stakes are really high for kids. We know that. For all kids, relational stakes are high. They can be very high for our young people as well. So negotiating that peer relationship. Something's, gone on with Cindy today. I don't understand why she's not talking to me. She was talking to me yesterday. What have I done? I don't know how to negotiate that. That makes me feel very unsafe in my peer relationships. So you land all that for a young person from a trauma background. Every one of those demands can land in the body as a possible threat. Yeah. So the nervous system's looking for the escape route. They're back down in the lower part of their brain. They're back down in the fight, flight, freeze form. We can so all of these things can be impacting, and we might not even be aware, that all of those things have impacted. We have, they're not as visible. Some of these things aren't as visible, in the everyday classroom. So again, trying to help people be aware of that these are the things that are happening for our young person, and talking with the young person around it as well. So when we're talking about strategies, we're not just talking about strategies at the start of the day, we're potentially talking about what are the strategies that we need to be thinking about in all of the day. So if we know that a young person is restless sitting at the desk, what's the regulation we're putting in place? If we know that new content is threatening, how are we introducing new content? What's the supports that we're putting in place, and so on and so on. God, this is a very busy slide. All right, we'll get through this one. I'll try and get this one through pretty quickly. Just the basics of what works well. I'm not telling you anything that you wouldn't already know, but I guess I just want to emphasise some of the things that we know work well for kids. Relationship. We know relationship comes first. We know that, trauma healing happens in the context of safe, nurturing, predictable relationships. The same thing in schools, right? Who in the school does the young person connect with? Who can help the child feel safe, particularly, when there's a lot of stresses going on in their day. It's really important that we establish that. And, if it's the guidance officer in a high school and the guidance officer is there for 2 days a week, well, what are we doing on the other 3 days? Because for sure, our young person will need to connect with that young person on one of the days that the guidance officer is away, etc., etc. Routine, predictability, consistency, so important for our young people to feel safe. Good schools, I know, have a predictable routine for when change happens. So if, for instance, they suddenly have to go to a rainy day program, there's a process that they have, with the young person, which is around, this is a change, here's how it's coming, this is what it looks like, we've done this before, are you okay with that? So even changes have a predictability and a consistency in how they're negotiated and talked through. I talked about we need regulate, relate, reason strategies, often throughout the day. Something that I really try and encourage schools to have and to show young people is this really positive belief, like being told and shown, we like it when you're here. I know from some of my work in flexi schools that when we talk to a young person who'd had, really bad days and, really escalated and made it really unsafe for everybody, when we brought them back into the space and said, we like it when you're here, we've got to figure out how you can be here and be safe for yourself and for others. For some kids, it was the first time that they were ever told, that they had a place in school and they belonged at school and we valued their learning. So if we can encourage schools to show that positive belief with young people, it's very powerful, and I think it's so important for our kids because so often they feel like that they don't belong at school or they don't, that they're not learners. Everybody has a potential to be a learner. So we just got to find the ways to make sure that they can be. I talk a lot about time in, not time out. When young people are showing escalating behaviours, it's really indicating a need that we need more connection, not less. Doesn't mean we're going soft on kids, doesn't mean there's no boundaries, doesn't mean there's no expectations, but how do we negotiate them in meaningful ways, which is really the next focus, which is having a solutions focus, like sitting down with the young person. We notice that, every time you're walking between the maths and the English class, you're getting into strife in the hallway. Like, what's going on there? Like, what's happening? And then what can we do about it? How can we solve that problem? Being really genuine in that problem-solving approach, the Ross Green approach. And again, I can talk to you about that forever. But that's how you build executive functioning skills. Remember back when I talked about the frontal part of the brain, that reasoning, that problem-solving, That's how you build those skills, is by engaging young people genuinely in problem-solving conversations, finding solutions to the things that aren't working, giving those things a go. When they don't work again, giving it another go, having another conversation about it. I think co-regulation is another thing that we tend to, I don't know how many education plans I have read that talk about the young person will utilise their self-regulation strategies, when they start to get heightened. And then you see that the young person's on a suspension. Well, obviously they can't utilise their self-regulation strategies when they're getting heightened, or they couldn't in that situation. So why not? Yeah. And sometimes I've seen that strategy, they start talking about it in the plan in grade 3, and in the plan in grade 8, it's still the same thing as being listed, in the plan. It's obviously not working, for the young person. So often what is needed is co-regulation. Often they just need someone to borrow calm from. And that means not having an adult talking about consequences, not having an adult standing over them saying, remember your self-regulation strategies. It's really just about being present with the young person, getting down at their level, breathing with them, until they can calm enough down to that point where then they can perhaps, utilise some of those self-regulation strategies. So if self-regulation strategies aren't working in a school, I'll try and start talk to them about maybe what they need first is some co-regulation. All of this takes time, and the pathway is not always straight. So it's not like we put in place a strategy and it works, and that means that, the trajectory is always that way. We know that there's backward steps and sideways steps. We know young people can do really well, and it's one of the things that can be confusing for schools sometimes is when you hear, but we've seen them do it really well. We've seen them use their strategies really well, and it's worked. Well, it did on that day. It didn't on this day. Perhaps there was something that happened with a peer before they walked into the classroom that set them at such a level that they couldn't access, those strategies. So again, just that awareness of, things can look different almost day to day, and we just got to keep hanging in there. And always just remember, building on strengths. What does a young person enjoy at school, and can we do a bit more of that? If they're having a really difficult time at school. And I think this is my last slide, and then I'll stop talking. I've talked for longer than I said I was going to. I always do. What supports good working relationships with schools? Again, pretty self-evident, but it can take some work to build positive relationships. Again, particularly when, there's more complexity happening, but trying to hang in there, trying to find ways of building positive relationships is, so important. Being really proactive with schools, like really saying, when a young person is perhaps starting in a new school, we anticipate that there's going to be some escalations, We anticipate that these are some of the things that are going to be triggers. What can we do? Like what can we put in place proactively that supports that, so that it doesn't come as a surprise, so that we're trying to instill straight away that these are not deliberate misbehaviours, they're signs of, their stress responses. I always think it's really important to approach a school with the desired outcome or the problem, as opposed to kind of, asking straight away for a solution. So instead of going to a school saying, we really have to have full-time teacher aid time for Dale, or he's not going to, be able to stay at school for the day, come with, we think it's really important that Dale gets a full school day because he's missing too much learning. What needs to be put in place so this can happen? So you come into the problem together, You're not coming trying to demand a solution that can put a school off, but you do have an expectation of what you think is best for Dale and his learning. How can we kind of get that together? Get to there. So that's that next point, home plus school, not home versus school. If you're finding yourself talking negatively a lot about school, with your young person or in front of your young person, just be careful around that. I know working with some schools can be really frustrating, and I know we want to show empathy with the young person about some of the difficulties that they're having at school. To be careful about how we do it so that they still have a feeling that school is a place for them and that they belong at school. Yeah, if there's too much negative talk around school with a young person, I just worry about the consequences of that it can really put them off school and kind of feel like, well, it is so hard, we're never going to get there. And then there can be, a bit of a giving up around school. Doesn't mean that you can't show empathy. Gee, that is sounding like it's really difficult at school at the moment. Yeah, I think we need to go to the school and have a conversation about how we can make that a bit better for you. Yeah, I can really hear, that things are pretty tough there at the moment. But what can we do? So you can talk about it without kind of going, that school is it's really hopeless. They don't know what they're doing. They're being really unfair all the time. That, like that kind of language can be really complex, yeah, for a kid to be hearing all the time. And all behaviour is communication. So if a school is reacting in really stressed ways, they probably are really stressed. So in the same way that all children's behaviour is communication, the school's behaviour is communication as well. So what are the messages that we're getting from the school? That was a lot. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm hopeful that people have got some questions or something that they'd like to talk about as well. Is that back? Have I successfully stopped sharing? Excellent. I love the way my 20 minutes always goes to more. Sorry about that. Any questions, comments?
There's a lovely comment from Susan actually in the chat to get us started. Really, I liked it too. Just the way you described co-regulation being someone to borrow calm from. It was very lovely. So Susan just pointed that out.
Yeah, didn't come from me. I would have read it somewhere for sure. But yes, I like it too. That's probably why I borrowed it.
Yeah.
I think, like you said, the more you're working with schools and really understanding their limited resources, I think if you acknowledge that and say, hey, look, I know that you have limited resources, you're trying to look after the whole classroom, but we really think it's important that, that Billy re-engages. I think just that little bit, and actually understanding, not just, paying lip service to it, but that understanding goes a long way. And I think they're a lot more willing to come to the party and help out and do that when they know that you aren't just coming in with some unrealistic expectations, because I think cost is pretty big. I think SLSOs cost about $350 a day. I mean, there's a lot, they've got limited resources. So I think if you acknowledge that, and like you said, kind of work together rather than just coming in demanding, but just kind of understanding how can we work together, whatever that looks like, and come in with a bit of humility, I think that does go a long way.
Oh, it goes all the way. Because you don't do that in relationship, or key value is relationships, right? So how do we foster good relationship? And understanding that they're within their structure and their policies and procedures, there's a lot of red flags for them. And I think it's really important to understand our obligation to share information. And 16A Child Protection Act requires us to share information, whether it's concerning well-being, development, and progress. So sharing that information, putting that support plan, all that sort of stuff to build their capacity to understand the young person, will also provide them with tools needed to apply funding to provide that support with the schools straight away before the transition. And if it hasn't happened yet, we can do it. We can backtrack. Hey, here's the information. Apologies for not providing that. Humility again. Apologies for brave. We're not sure we could, but here it is. And this is why we didn't do the visual thing. So you can work.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Tony and Alex. They're really they're great points around.
Sorry, just one more. Just to again piggyback on what you said about speaking positively about schools. I mean, our young people, they have ears. Like, they pick up on stuff, they'll repeat it, they're sponges, they'll even just the vibe. If you're going in and or at the house, if you just have a really negative view about a school, even if they're not coming to the party, not doing the right thing, it's so important that we kind of stay professional and just go, you know what, maybe there's a hiccup in the road, but we're going to get there. That goes a long way, because otherwise, like you said, the kids are the young people are going to already go in just going, hey, you're a crap school. I'm not going to, you know what I mean? Like whereas if we're going, yep, you know what, there's some challenges, but hey, this is an important school. You're there. This is great. And it's just, again, it seems like such a small thing, but they do pick up on it, and it can just shift yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Perfect. Just everything you said, absolutely. Just couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Also to note that schools aren't trained on trauma. Not every teacher understands trauma. So it's like police officers, they don't understand. They're not, unless they go to that particular unit around, helping young people positive support, um, or SSLOs and stuff like that. Most teachers don't understand. They see the young person doesn't look disabled as an naughty young person. And unless we provide that information and support to even if they have, because I got a couple of young people that are in like mainstream that sort of still in supported units, but they sort of transition from support units to mainstream. And the mainstream teachers, even though they're getting a lot of information from the supported units, we're time limited. We could think that teachers, when they go to their breaks, they're not sitting and talking about work. They're quickly eat, they're back to work, and they've got pressure for curriculum pressure and a whole bunch of other stuff that they have to match. And when a young person misbehaves in class, it stuffs all their plans up, you know what I mean? It puts them back, and then they get pressure from their superiors and everyone else around. Why isn't all of your class up to date with the curriculum? So there's a lot of stuff going on we're not aware. So sharing that, giving that space for them to understand how to best. I think I don't know if every school does this, but the schools up here, they have like a card system where the young people have cards with them, like a yellow card or a red card, and they can just put it on their desk or flash it to their teacher, and the teacher knows straight away if they need space. So as soon as they flash that card, they go outside and they have an area, designated area where they can go, or a corner of the room, depending on their age, of course. And it's already set up with them with some sensory stuff and a whole bunch of stuff. So it's already planned. That works so well because it doesn't disrupt the class. It's quickly, the young person's communicated. And if the young person can't communicate, the teachers also come up with strategies with our support on how to be able to pick up on those triggers before that happens. So there is no escalation. Like we do in ITC, like we do, with we provide that knowledge to carers. I mean, imagine carers not having any idea on how to support a young person. The same thing. We have great transition plans for young people going to new carers or to ITC homes to really how to transition to schools.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Transition planning is, I couldn't advocate stronger for really well-planned transitions. And again, sometimes school transitions happen so quickly, like sometimes when, a young person comes into care or, and they're leaving their school and they're coming into a new school and, things can happen really quickly. But as much planning and meeting and setting things up proactively as possible, we know that that's when kids have the best success. And the transition isn't just for the first day. Like a good transition plan goes, well into the first 6 months, of school. What's going to be happening in that first 6 months? What are the additional supports that we might need then that hopefully we can start to pull back on a little bit? If we think of Tony's point about resourcing, let's put some more intense resourcing at the start with the hope that we can, withdraw, some of that resourcing. Yeah.
Sorry, one more thing, not to be sad, but obviously if everyone knows, if there's any kind of a change, so if a new young person moves in, or even you could probably say, it's change of case manager or any significant change, there is the form that you can send into the Department of Education. That's what releases think it's an extra $2,000, or do you know what I mean? So it seems like a small amount, but again, if we're vigilant to do that, I think it's showing the school, hey, we're trying to help you in there, because that's the only way they get this additional resources. So it's just on our part making sure that we're doing that consistently.
Thanks, Tony. And you're New South Wales, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So that's in New South
Another way.
Wales.
Sorry,
That's
yeah, it must be. Yeah, that's right.
But
Yeah.
but yes, people in New South Wales use it. And Wayne, I see you've got your hand up, so love to hear from you.
Hi, how you going? Yeah, it's very a lot of information there. It makes a lot of sense. I have a question. I have a young person. We're in Western Sydney, and he's just recently started at the LWBE school at the Mount Druitt campus. And you just spoke about the transition period, being difficult, and that's what we're seeing with our young person. And at the moment, he's not there. They've sort of given him an opportunity to cooling off period, as they've described it. We're looking at transitioning him back into the school, and we've suggested one of our therapeutic support workers go there, and I've just received email with guidelines, and basically. It's a lot to take on as a therapeutic support worker. It's basically an SLSO sort of role for the first 4 weeks. And me, I'm the house manager at the house. And yeah, it's going to be a lot for us to take on. I totally understand we've got to pump resources into it. So, but what are your thoughts on having therapeutic support workers moving into the classroom to offer support?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really complex question, Wayne, and I'm giving the context too that that's a brand new school startup. So there's a lot of additional complexities when you're bringing young people into a brand new culture. When a school culture is established, particularly in a flexi environment, things are easier because there's a school culture already established, if that makes sense. When you're trying to establish a school culture with, everyone's new, the staff are new, the young people are new, so that extra kind of resourcing and protection for both the school and the young person is really important. What we don't want to happen is for a young person to experience failure, I guess, in that new environment. And we try to be really careful in some ways about who we bring into a new school environment, but sometimes we bring, a young person in who potentially would have been better brought in 6 months down the track or 12 months down the track, but sometimes you don't know, right, until you start. So, I just think getting close, with the staff, they'll be trying their best in a pretty, complicated situation. I know what that situation, is for all the new startups. They're not the smoothest or the easiest of startups. They're co-located in the PCYC space, so they're having to negotiate a whole other agency as well in that. So I would lean in and just try and work as closely together. And, I think if there's some therapeutic support that can happen, I think that will only help the young person, and it'll help the staff as well and help build that good relationship. So, if you've got some questions around, how they're being utilised, have the conversation, but do it, but try and come from it again from a perspective of, we get it, you're new, every young person in that place is new. Nobody knows each other. The staff don't even know each other very well yet at this stage. It's a complicated environment. Everybody will be doing their best, just getting close and work closely with them would be my perspective on that one. But thanks for bringing that up. Hey, I'm just really conscious that we're at time. I just want to thank everybody so much for participating. I hope it's been useful, and I really, really look forward to catching up with people in a month's time. Take care, everyone, and don't forget to reach out.